Okay, everybody, good to have you here tonight. I'm going to get started. If you were coming in, you probably saw there's 3 handouts tonight instead of one. One handout really and 2 articles that I hope will be interesting to you that you can take home with you, and they will relate to a couple of different subjects that we're going to talk about tonight. But this is going to be the last session that I'm going to give in this series. This really is a 4-part series, but then we're going to add a 5th week next week because we have a guest speaker coming in. Stephen Massoud is going to come, and he's a man who was Muslim, grew up in a Muslim community, but then converted to Christianity, and he's going to give his story and then talk about his ministry, reaching out to the Muslim community and sharing the gospel with them. So you'll definitely want to join us next week for that. It's going to be great. But tonight, what we're going to do is try to kind of wrap things up, and this session I'm calling How Do We Respond as Christians, and trying to think more through practical issues and practical questions about how should we think through interacting with Islam, how should we think through some of the more practical theological issues and some of the more controversial theological issues. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight, but tonight we're also doing a little bit of what I call cleanup, and I'm trying to cover a couple subjects that we didn't have time to cover before. So we have a lot of ground to cover, but one of the things I want to start out with is to talk about the Muslim view of women and the issues surrounding women and marriage in Islam, because that's a question that many people have and many people hear about. It's sometimes a controversial question, and so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that tonight. First of all, we have to just acknowledge that not all Muslims have the same views regarding women and marriage. So practices will differ from country to country somewhat, and by and large, Muslims in the United States would probably have a different approach to this than Muslims, let's say, who are living in Afghanistan or Iraq. So it's going to differ somewhat. And we can't necessarily generalize for the entire Muslim community. Just like it is with so many other issues, we can't generalize for all of the Muslim community. Now, having said that, though, what we can observe is there are some trends and issues within Islam that are somewhat troubling when it comes to issues surrounding women. So first of all, the practice of polygamy has been generally and historically accepted within Islam. This goes all the way back to Muhammad, and you may remember we talked about this during the first week, but Muhammad practiced polygamy. He married his first wife and was married to her for many years, but after she died, he took the practice of polygamy and had multiple wives. In fact, he had about 10 wives, and one of them was only 9 years old when he married her. So it was a bit of a strange situation there, but that is... Polygamy became standard practice within Islam, and it continues to be standard practice for many Muslims today, although not all Muslims. There is an understanding from the Quran and within Islam that the rule is that a Muslim man can have up to 4 wives. And there's a variety of attitudes toward this in Islam today. Some Muslims would embrace that idea and say, yes, you can practice and have up to 4 wives. Some Muslims would say, no, we don't really believe that anymore, and we would think that would be unwise. And then it also differs from country to country. So in Muslim majority countries, they have different ways of regulating this, and so some would regulate it and allow it, others would more restrict it, and so there's different ways in which it's practiced. But generally speaking, Islam has been open to polygamy, and the understanding in Islam is up to 4 wives can be had. In addition to that, historically in Islam, women have been perceived to be inferior to men. So they've had much fewer rights provided to women than to men. For example, according to the Quran, men are allowed to divorce their wives, but wives are not allowed to divorce their husbands. Now that's changed today in some Muslim countries, but that's been the historic practice. And additionally, the punishment for different crimes, personal moral crimes such as adultery, is more severe towards women than it is to men. And so again, women are perceived to be inferior They have fewer rights provided than they do men. And I think it's worth noting that's not necessarily something historically that's necessarily unique to Islam. That's been true in a lot of cultures, that women have not had as many rights as men. But that's something we definitely see in Islam, and that even comes out in the Quran, that is taught. Another thing we hear a lot about when we talk about Muslim view of women is this issue of veils and burqas, which a burqa is the basically a robe that some Muslim women wear that covers a woman's body from head to toe. And the practice of these, of veils and burqas, and you'll notice that not all Muslims have the same practices with regard to this. So you'll see Muslim women in the U.S. who only wear the veil or the scarf kind of that covers their hair and their head, but not their face, and the rest of their body is not covered with a burqa or something like that. So there's a variety of practices here, but here's where this comes from, and here's one example from the Quran. So in Surah 24 it says, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty." That's where this comes from, is passages like this. The idea of a burqa, though, which is a head-to-toe covering, that's not explicitly found in the Quran. That's just a practice that developed over time. And again, Muslims wear a variety of different types of veils versus burqas. Now, there's some countries, and you can see this, where they do wear burqas and they're covered head to toe, and all that is seen is just a little slit for the eyes. Other places, there's sort of more of a robe, and it doesn't cover the whole face, just covers the hair and the head, and then kind of covers the shoulders. And then, like I said, you have the whole spectrum of, also you see women in the U.S. who just have mostly kind of a scarf over their heads. So quite a large variety of practices here. And some people might ask, well, what on earth is the purpose of all of this? Why would they do this? And from everything I've read about Islam, the primary purpose of these is to prevent women from being looked at lustfully and sort of, if you want to put it in these terms, sort of protecting women from being looked at lustfully, or protecting women from being ogled at by men who are not their husbands. And, so that's sort of the understanding behind this, as you can get from these passages in the Quran. And, of course, I don't agree with the practice of all women having to wear veils or women having to wear burqas or anything like that. As a Christian and as a non-Muslim, I would never defend that practice. But I think there is something interesting that could be learned here, because it's funny to me sometimes that as Americans, we're often very quick to criticize this whole business of veils and burqas, and we say that, this is so oppressive to women. And again, I don't think women should have to wear veils and burqas, just to be clear. But it's interesting to me that we say that, but in America, we go to such the opposite extreme that it's just absolutely unbelievable. I mean, we plaster women on billboards and magazines with bikinis and lingerie, and sometimes just fully naked. And we seem to think that the worst part of it all is that we do this and we say that we're liberating women. Now, help me understand how that liberates women. To me, that's enslaving women to a whole different kind of thing, which is making them into sex objects, which as a Christian, I don't condone at all. And so, where we could criticize Islam for going to one extreme, and I think that's a valid criticism, but I think we sometimes, in American culture, we go to the opposite extreme, and we just make women into sex objects, and we say somehow this is liberating to women. I think that's oppressive to women as well. So again, you can go to different extremes, and I wouldn't advocate either one of those extremes. I would advocate somewhere in the middle would be a more respectful way to approach women. So we see that, though, in Islam, is this issue of veiling and burqas. The other question is that some people sometimes ask, and they've heard about, the issues of abuse of women within Islam, and is this a big problem? And people have asked me that question. And the reason behind this is because some of us have heard before, as we've read about Islam or if we've read bits of the Quran, that some Muslims believe it's permissible to actually abuse your wife. And the place where that comes from is a passage like this one. In Surah 4, it says, "As to those on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct," it's talking about wives here, "admonish them, refuse to share their beds, beat them." There's a couple passages in the Quran like this that are very disturbing and very problematic, if you ask me. And it's true that there have been some Muslims historically who have looked at passages like this and have seen a warrant for actually abusing their wife. Now, again, we need to be careful here because I'm not suggesting tonight that all Muslims believe that, and I would think if you talk to probably the average Muslim, say, who lives in the U.S., they would say it's not permissible to beat your wife. But that's something I think that's a little bit disturbing that we find in the Quran, and some Muslims have utilized that in ways that are not positive at all. And in addition to that, we see other disturbing practices around the globe. We don't find it in the U.S., but we see other disturbing practices such as honor killings, where an honor killing is basically when a member of the family is killed or executed because they've brought shame upon the family for an immoral act or sometimes converting to another religion. And one of the disturbing things about these honor killings that you find is that there's a disproportionate number of women who are victims of honor killings because oftentimes, like I said, they're treated more harshly in Islamic culture, and they're often accused of wrongdoing more than men are, and so we see that as another problem. So one thing we could say in conclusion, I think it's true historically that Islam actually did bring some improvements for women, but it still has some very troubling problems. And the reason I say that is because when Islam emerged in pre-Islamic Arabia, it did actually somewhat improve the situation for women. In that culture, in pre-Islamic Arabia, when Muhammad that time emerged, there was all kinds of just really horrifying practices. Female infants were buried alive because they didn't want them. Women were routinely raped and beaten and all of these other things. And when Islam emerged, it actually regulated marriage to some degree and put an end to some of these barbaric practices. And so it actually did improve the situation for women somewhat. But again, it's all relative and it's on a scale. And as we fast forward to today, as we can see, there's still some very troubling things in terms of how Islam views women and treats them. And I think we would say that even though it improved the situation from the year 600, today there's still some very, very troubling things there. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about what I think is probably one of the most controversial subjects when it comes to Islam. That's the whole question of what we call or understand and hear about in terms of jihad. So what is jihad and what should we think about this stuff? Well, the word jihad, sometimes you hear it translated when we're talking about in American culture as holy war. The word in Arabic just literally means struggle. So that basic Arabic word jihad just is a generic word for the word struggle. And the way it's used within Islam is it's a word that's an understanding to struggle against things that are unholy or those things that are against the will of Allah. So it's struggling against all of those things. And there's actually, in Islam, there's various types of jihad. So some people have said there's 4 or 5 different types of jihad that Muslims will talk about. So the first type is jihad of the heart. And jihad of the heart refers to struggling against your own sinful tendencies. So you have sinful desires, sinful tendencies within you, and jihad of the heart is struggling against those to push them away, to not give in to those desires. Then the second type is jihad of the mouth, which refers to struggling against opponents of Islam by using speech, by refuting their arguments, by saying things that will protect the reputation of Islam. And then the third type is jihad of the pen, which is very similar, but of course that's the written word. So that refers to using the written word to promote Islam and to defend Islam and those kinds of things. So those first 3 types are sometimes referred to what might be called spiritual jihad within Islam. The fourth type is jihad of the hand, and that refers to doing good deeds to try to promote Islam and to show the superiority of Islam. So Muslims believe that when they do good deeds, it actually can show that their religion is superior by the way that they act in the world, and demonstrate the superiority of their message. And then, of course, that brings us to the last type of jihad, which is jihad of the sword. And this is the one that is the most well known. And although jihad can be understood in a variety of different ways within Islam, there's really no question that this is the primary way that it's understood within Islam, is jihad of the sword. Typically when the Quran talks about it, this is the primary type of jihad that it's referencing. And this is the primary understanding that you find in Islamic history and Islamic jurisprudence. So unfortunately, this is the most disturbing type of jihad because it refers to warring against the enemies of Islam, to actually taking up the sword and warring against the enemies of Islam. So, who are the enemies of Islam? Well, we could name a few categories. First of all, there's unbelievers. Those are enemies of Islam, and those are anyone who rejects Muhammad's message. A second type of enemies of Islam would be those who commit the sin of what in Arabic is called shirk. And shirk is similar to idolatry. It refers to substituting in the place of Allah anything besides Him, worshiping something in His place, idolizing something in creation over Him. And then the third category of enemies of Islam are referred to as the hypocrites. And we talked about this a week or two ago, but hypocrites in Islam refers to anyone who leaves the faith, anyone who joins another religion, anyone who forsakes Islam and converts. Those are known as the hypocrites. And you may remember from last week that the highest or the most severe level of hell is reserved for them. And according to Sharia law, if a person leaves the Islamic faith, they can be executed according to Sharia law. And that is actually practiced in some Islamic countries. That, again, refers back to these honor killings. There are cases where people convert from Islam, they leave the faith, let's say a person is Muslim and they become a Christian, and they can be literally killed just because they've done that. And that, again, it connects to this understanding of jihad of the sword. So how is that carried out then? Well, this gets incredibly confusing because if you look at the Quran and look at what it says about various types of warfare in this regard, it has different things that it says. So it's hard to put all these pieces of the puzzle together. The Quran actually says different things at different points. Some scholars have actually looked at this and they've suggested that Muhammad's thinking on this actually developed over time. And so when he may have thought one thing at one point, and then he sort of changed and developed again, and then he changed and developed a little bit more. And so you actually find different statements in the Quran about this. So first of all, early on, it seems like Muhammad actually advocated to his followers to use peaceful persuasion when trying to spread the message. So you'll find a passage like this in the Quran. In Surah 16, it says, "Invite all to the way of thy Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in ways that are best and most gracious. But if you show patience, that is indeed the best course for those who are patient." So this passage just seems to advocate sort of peaceful persuasion, and that's one way that the Quran says to deal with the unbelievers. But as time went on, then it seems like Muhammad's thinking changed a little bit. And there's other places in the Quran where it seems to talk about this in terms of no longer peaceful persuasion, but now in terms more of self-defense and warding off aggressors. So look at this passage in Surah 2. It says, "Fight in the cause of God those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for God loveth not transgressors, and slay them wherever you catch them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out. But if they fight you, slay them. Such is the reward of those who suppress the faith." So this passage seems to suggest something more in terms of warding off aggressors, self-defense. It says there's limits to how much you want to fight. And that's a little bit more of a progression from this idea of peaceful persuasion, but it's a step kind of in a different direction. So as you read the Quran more, then it seems as though Muhammad takes a step even further than that as his thinking developed. So as time went on, it seems like Muhammad started thinking of jihad more, or should I say less in terms of a defensive kind of warring and more in terms of an offensive kind of fighting. And that even suggesting that those who lose their lives in battle, in jihad, would be guaranteed entrance into heaven. So if you look at Surah 9, here's what this says. When the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in each and every ambush. But if they repent, perform the prayers, and give alms, then leave their way free. So this seems like it's taken a step further. Now it's not just talking about defensive sort of warfare, it's talking about offensive jihad. So this is definitely more than what we saw before. And then as this developed, it really developed into what some people have called expansionist jihad, which is basically what was practiced late in Muhammad's life and by his successors and his followers after he died, that was sort of this sort of practice of being able to attack non-Muslims in any season and on any land that wasn't yet surrendered to Islam. Now, again, if you remember back to the first week, we have to be fair here, and we have to be willing to look at the history and say they weren't when in the first few centuries. When Islam was expanding, they typically didn't just go in and say, okay, now convert to Islam or die. They conquered the lands, and they typically let Christians and Jews continue to practice. But nevertheless, this expansionist jihad was still in play, and that they felt like you could just attack any land and expand the empire to any land that wasn't surrendered to Islam. So again, it wasn't forced conversions under the sword typically. That did happen some, but that was fairly rare. But it was this form of expansionist jihad. Incidentally, I think it's interesting to observe, and I mentioned this the first week, that it seems like Muslims in the first few centuries of the faith were more tolerant of letting Christians and Jews continue practicing than they are today, because as you look at Muslim countries today, there's a lot of very frightening things going on, especially for Christians. But this idea of expansionist jihad continued to sort of shape the understanding within Islam. And you find another passage like this in the Quran. So it says in Surah 9, "Fight those who believe not in God nor the last day, nor hold to be forbidden that which has been forbidden by God and his apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book," i.e. Christians and Jews, "until they pay the jizya, which is a poll tax, and with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." So again, this gets into that sort of expansionist jihad. So we see that this is very clearly found in the Quran, and that it was practiced by Muslims for centuries after, at the end of Muhammad's life, and by his successors in the centuries following. That Islam, as we looked at during the first week, was really spread through conquest, and there was this understanding of sort of expansionist jihad that was being put into play. So that then brings the question then, so how do Muslims then understand jihad if we ask this today? Well, it depends on who you ask. And that's why this is just sort of a mess for us to try to define in our culture. Because there are Muslims who, especially I would guess many of the Muslims who live in the U.S., who would say that they would point to the passages in the Quran, and I've even seen interviews and seen religious discussions where this is done. They would point to the passages in the Quran and say, here's these passages about peaceful persuasion, and they would say, those are the ones that we believe in. We don't believe in all this other using the sword stuff. These are the true passages. Of course, the problem is those other passages are still in there, which is kind of problematic for them. But there are Muslims today who would just say, no, we only believe in the peaceful persuasion approach. There's other Muslims who would say, no, we don't believe in attacking people and taking initiative, but we do believe in the self-defense approach. If somebody attacks us, then we have the right to ward off the aggressor and to defend ourselves. And then there's others in more radical Islam that would actually believe that you can take this sort of offensive jihad and attack people who are not Muslims. So again, how do Muslims understand jihad? Well, it depends on who you ask, and you have all these different understandings represented. And the problem is, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, but regardless of where these Muslims come down on the issue, and they do come down in a variety of different places on what they believe about this, there's still these problematic passages in the Quran. So it brings up this larger question, which is Islam a violent religion? And that's what a lot of people are interested in America today and want to know more about. And you know, as Americans in the past 15 years or so, we witnessed the September 11th attacks, which were clearly motivated by basically offensive jihad, understanding of jihad that was warrants killing unbelievers wherever they're found. And so we ask the question, is Islam a violent religion? Well, again, Islam is not homogeneous, and so not all Muslims believe the same thing about jihad. We already said that. There are many Muslims living in the United States who have no interest in violence. They're perfectly happy to live in America and just quietly live out their lives. I'm sure some of you probably know people like this. In fact, I've talked to quite a few people during this series who've come up to me and said, yeah, I've got this person I know at work, and he's Muslim, and I've had conversations with him, or my neighbor who is part of the school, or, you know, there's Muslims in most large communities in the United States, and we know that many of them are not interested in violence and want to just quietly live out their lives. And there would be other Muslims outside the United States who would feel the same way. So we need to be informed and not just paint everybody with the same broad brush. Now, having said that, it's clear that there is support for offensive jihad in the Quran and in Muhammad's life. So we saw passages in the Quran that support offensive jihad and that clearly teach that that's acceptable. And Muhammad's life would suggest that that's acceptable, because that's what Muhammad practiced and that's what his successors practiced. And many Muslims today view Muhammad as a great role model, a hero who should be emulated. So if that's the case, then that would mean emulating these very violent practices that Muhammad practiced, which is obviously very problematic. And so again, we can find support for these in the Quran and in Muhammad's life. And that's very troubling. In addition to that, we have a number of troubling trends around the globe. So first of all, we have the growth of radical Islam around the globe, which has seemed to increase in recent years. Again, there's different brands of Islam, and not all Muslims are the same, but it seems like radical Islam has actually grown and has had an increased influence around the globe, which is obviously a very disturbing trend. On top of that, with the growth of radical Islam has been the growth of Islamic terrorism has grown, because radical Islam basically encourages Islamic terrorism. And so we've seen not only the growth in radical Islam, but growth in Islamic terrorism. And, you know, of course, the easiest example of that to point out is September 11th. You know, thousands of lives were lost because of Islamic terrorism that was rooted in an understanding of offensive or expansionist jihad. And then a third category, another troubling trend, is the increase of Christian persecution, which has continued to be fierce and is found in many Muslim-majority countries across the globe. The worst Christian persecution today is in Muslim-majority countries. And Christians are, generally speaking, not treated well. I printed off one article for you that was actually written last year, but I thought it summarized some good thoughts about Christian persecution in the Islamic world. But it's clear that Christians are being persecuted, and they're being intensely persecuted in Muslim-majority countries. One of the most recent examples of this, and we could talk a whole night about it and talk about dozens of examples, but one of the most recent examples was in Egypt, and everybody remembers this from last year. But the Egyptian Coptic Christians were being fiercely persecuted within the last year. And one of the main things that we saw happening was churches were being burned down. There was dozens of churches that were literally burned to the ground by Islamic extremists. So this is something that's happening around the world, and I think we need to be informed about that. We need to be aware of it, because there's many people who aren't aware of it. And I think that it's important for the American church to be informed, especially about Christian persecution, because these are our brothers and sisters in Christ. We need to be praying for them and supporting them and not just ignoring it or sweeping it under the rug or being ignorant about it. This is a very real situation that's going on around the world, and these are people who need our help, and we need to raise awareness about Christian persecution in Muslim-majority countries that's going on around the world. But at the same time, when I say we should be informed and we should be troubled, I don't think we should be paranoid. And I think there's a difference between being troubled and paranoid. I think we should be troubled by what's going on. I am very troubled about the growth of radical Islam. I'm very troubled by the increase of Islamic terrorism, and I am extremely troubled by the fact that Christian persecution in Muslim-majority countries has continued to increase and doesn't seem to be slowing down. But I think there's a difference between being troubled and informed and then paranoid. And when I say that, what I mean is that, as at the beginning of this, I said that I don't think it's a wise thing to go out and into our community and every time we meet somebody who's a Muslim to be paranoid about them. I don't think that's a good approach. Because again, I think first of all what that does is it paints everyone with the same broad brush, but also it's not a very good approach if we're going to want to go out and love our neighbors, is it? You can't love somebody very well if you're afraid of them and you don't want anything to do with them. And so I think there's a difference between being troubled and being paranoid. Does that make sense? Okay. If you don't like what I said, you can come and yell at me later.
Before you get to the Christian, you didn't mention Sharia law.
We talked about Sharia law last week.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can get a good recap of that on the video, which I can tell you more about. So yeah, we talked about Sharia a little bit last week, but I can tell you more about that if you'd like. So let's move to another question then, in this same category. Some people, and this is a frustrating thing when we get into these conversations, when you get into a conversation about Islamic terrorism or violence in Islam, I've been in many conversations where people have wanted to come to the defense of Islam and have said, well, what about Christian violence? Haven't Christians been guilty of a great deal of violence? Haven't they been historically guilty of violence through the centuries? And if that's the case, then aren't they guilty of just the same thing, which is committing violence in the name of religion? And so is Christianity basically equivalent to Islam in this regard? That's an important question I think we need to discuss, because that's something that will come up if you have conversations with people. I guarantee you that always comes up, and it's important to know how to even approach that question. So first of all, the first thing I would say is we need to be honest and admit that Christians don't have a perfect record. Okay? If you say that Christians have a perfect record, then we're just ignoring the history books, because we're not perfect. Okay? No, we're sinful people, and we don't have a perfect record throughout history. And of course, the example that you like to bring up is the Crusades. That's the easy target. That's the one that's always usually brought up when we get into these discussions. And so the Crusades, most of you know, were a period of time during the High Middle Ages when there were military campaigns that were sanctioned by the church and even proclaimed by the Pope. The Pope was encouraging people to go out and participate in these military campaigns, and he even said in some cases that if you participate in the campaign, you'll get an indulgence from me. Well, that's a nice gift. And the first Crusades were all against Muslims. And during those Crusades, there were thousands and thousands of Muslims that were killed by Christians. Now, what can we say about the Crusades? Well, first of all, we have to have a balanced view of history, okay? Because a lot